America's banking system is collapsing, and there is no central bank to call. 120 bankers stand locked inside a private library, and the only man with the key has pocketed it. By dawn, one man will decide who survives. It started 3 weeks earlier, with a stock trade almost no one noticed. Three weeks earlier, none of this had seemed possible. On October 14, 1907, a speculator named Otto Heinze tried something ordinary for Wall Street, cornering a stock. He and his brother believed short sellers of United Copper Company shares would have nowhere else to buy, so they bought aggressively, and the price jumped from $39 to $52 in a single day. The next day, it briefly touched $60, then collapsed, because the short sellers found shares somewhere else entirely. By Wednesday, the stock had fallen to $10. The exchange had suspended Heinze's trading privileges, and his brokerage firm had failed. Economic historian John Moen of the University of Mississippi traces what happened next. The Montana bank that had used those shares as loan collateral collapsed within days, and the men who ran it were forced out of 2 more banks. Depositors panicked at every bank Heinze or his associates had ever touched. One miscalculated stock trade, and within a week, New York's banking system was already cracking at points nobody had been watching. By the following Friday, the panic had found a target bigger and more dangerous than any single speculator. The story every popular retelling tells is a simple one. While Washington had no institution to call, one man, J.P. Morgan, stepped in almost alone and organized the rescue. That isn't quite what happened. The team Morgan assembled that week, George Baker of First National Bank, James Stillman of National City Bank, and Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou, was not an outside safeguard parachuting in. It was a small, personally connected circle of the same kind of banker whose over-leveraged, informally linked positions had helped the initial shock cascade in the first place. New York's national banks belonged to the clearinghouse, wired to a shared circuit that could absorb a surge. Trust companies were not wired to anything at all. So panic moved the way historians increasingly describe contagion moving, bank to bank, the way an infection spreads through a population that shares no immunity. Knickerbocker Trust failed. Then Trust Company of America. Then Lincoln Trust. By Thursday, October 24th, the mechanism reached the stock market itself. The morning's call money rate opened at 6%. By afternoon, a bid of 60% found no lenders at all. The rate reached 100% before NYSE President Ransom Thomas found emergency funds through Morgan, according to economic historian John Moen. What made bankers trust each other's promises when no institution stood behind any of them? The men who stepped in were not outsiders. They were the same circle. Baker, Stillman, Morgan himself. The network that let the shock spread was the only network with enough trust left to stop it. By Saturday night, that trust would be tested in the most literal way a system can test it, with a locked door. He is 70 years old, not a government official, a private banker, senior partner of the private banking house J.P. Morgan & Company, holding no public office of any kind, according to Encyclopedia Britannica's own biography of him. And in the last 2 weeks of October 1907, he is the closest thing the United States has to a lender of last resort. Not because any law made him one, but because nobody else was positioned to say yes. That is the promise this video opened with, in one sentence. The system is collapsing. The country has no central bank, and the last resort is a 70-year-old private citizen. Picture what a bank run actually is, not as a statistic, but as 3 hours on a Tuesday, On Friday, October 18, 1907, Charles T. Barney, president of Knickerbocker Trust, is reported to be an associate of a disgraced financier named Charles Morse. By the following Tuesday, depositors are lined up outside Knickerbocker's doors. The National Bank of Commerce covers the first withdrawals, then stops. The clearinghouse refuses to help. Knickerbocker isn't a member. Morgan sends a young banker, Benjamin Strong, to examine Knickerbocker's books. But there isn't enough time to find an answer before the run wins. Within 3 hours, New York's third-largest trust company has paid out $8 million in cash and shut its doors just after noon, according to Federal Reserve history. That is what the mechanism feels like from the inside. No examiner, no formal process, no institution with the authority to simply say the money is safe. Just a young man reading a ledger against a clock he cannot stop. 11 days later, on the night of November 2nd, roughly 120 bank and trust company officials are inside J.P. Morgan's private library. One trust company in the room is barely solvent. Another is about $1 million short of what it needs to survive the morning. Nobody in the room can leave. Morgan has had the doors locked and the key put in his own pocket. He tells them, in terms that leave no room for negotiation, that the trust companies have to provide a $25 million loan to the weaker institutions, or the whole system goes down together, according to historian Ron Chernow. For hours, nobody moves. At approximately 4:45 in the morning, the unofficial leader of the trust presidents finally signs. Then, one by one, the rest follow him. There was no vote. There was no regulator. There was a locked door, a pocketed key, and one man's judgment standing in for every safeguard the system did not have. What we've been calling a rescue is actually something colder. Proof that the system could not survive doing this twice. Even before the library scene resolved the trust crisis, a second fire had started. A heavily indebted brokerage, Moore and Schley, held stock in the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company as collateral, and a forced sale of that stock threatened to reignite the entire panic. On November 2nd, Morgan proposed a fix. U.S. Steel, the company he had helped build 6 years earlier, would acquire the railroad outright. President Theodore Roosevelt, a trust-busting president under his own antitrust law, approved it within hours. Here, the record gets genuinely uncertain. Some contemporaries and later historians, drawing on Ron Chernow's account, have argued Morgan used the panic's cover to secure that acquisition on unusually favorable terms. A reading the source itself flags as contested, not settled. What is not contested is that Morgan personally lost $21 million of his own money during the panic overall. A system that depends on one man's solvency, one man's willingness, and one man's judgment being available at 2 in the morning on a Saturday is not a system with a safety net. It is a system that got lucky, once, that the right man happened to be rich enough and present enough to answer. That was the argument Congress eventually heard. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law the same day Congress passed it, creating the institution meant to replace exactly this kind of improvisation. Benjamin Strong examined Knickerbocker's books for Morgan. In 1907, 6 years later, he ran the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Same man. Both ends of one story. Congress built an institution. Its first leaders came from the very informal network it was built to replace. More than a century later, this channel traced the same mechanism again. A single private company, not a government, acting as the market's lender of last resort. Different sector. Same absence. Same question. Every time a system depends on one actor's judgment instead of a rule, who decides that actor gets to say yes?